The more information you have, the better your decision should be. That idea feels natural. But you may have noticed something else. Sometimes the more you learn, the harder it becomes to decide. In the shorts, one question was left open. Why doesn't more information make decisions easier? This video continues from there. We usually imagine decision-making as a process of narrowing things down. You start with many options, you gather information, and eventually, one choice becomes clear. At least, that is how it is supposed to work. But in real life, something different often happens. The more we look into something, the more complicated it feels. The more information we collect, the less confident we become. This is not a personal failure. It is not a lack of intelligence. And it is not because you are bad at deciding. It is a pattern that shows up again and again when human beings face complexity. When choices were limited, decisions felt heavier but clear. When options expand, clarity does not increase at the same pace. Instead of moving closer to an answer, we often feel suspended between possibilities. Not because we lack data, but because our minds are trying to hold too much of it at once. Understanding this gap is the first step to understanding why more information does not automatically lead to better decisions. One reason this happens lies in how our minds handle information. Human cognition did not evolve to evaluate endless options side by side. It evolved to make decisions under limited, concrete conditions. When information increases, our brain does not simply add clarity. It also adds comparison. Every new piece of information creates another reference point, another angle, another possibility to weigh. Instead of asking, "Is this good enough?" we start asking, "Is this better than the others?" And that shift matters, because comparison requires context, and context multiplies faster than certainty. With each additional option, the mental workload grows, not linearly, but exponentially. At some point, the brain stops moving forward and starts looping. Re-evaluate, rechecking, second-guessing. This is not indecision. It is cognitive overload. The mind is not failing. It is protecting itself from committing too early in an environment that feels unstable. More information does not simplify the decision. It reshapes the decision into something harder to resolve. What makes this especially difficult is that overload does not feel like overload. It feels like responsibility. When we delay a decision, it often looks like careful thinking, like maturity, like trying to be thorough. But internally, something else is happening. The brain starts treating the decision as something that carries risk in every direction. Not choosing feels safer than choosing the wrong thing. So the mind shifts its goal. It stops trying to decide and starts trying to avoid regret. At that point, the question is no longer, "What should I choose?" It becomes, "How can I make sure I won't blame myself later?" This is where decision-making changes. Information is no longer used to move forward. It is used to defend the self. More data, more checking, more reassurance. Not because clarity is missing, but because certainty feels dangerous. The mind delays not because it is unsure, but because it senses that no option feels fully safe. And in that state, waiting feels rational, even when it quietly drains momentum. Once regret avoidance takes over, information changes its role. At first, we look for information to help us choose. But gradually, we start looking for information that confirms we are not wrong. This is a subtle shift. The question is no longer, "What is the best option?" It becomes, "Is there anything that proves this choice is safe?" And safety becomes defined, not by outcomes, but by the absence of responsibility. If no choice is made, no one can be blamed, including ourselves. So the mind keeps searching, not because it expects a clear answer, but because searching feels productive without requiring commitment. This creates an illusion of progress. Reading more, comparing again, watching another review, opening another tab. Each action feels responsible. Each one delays the moment of choice. And because the delay feels justified, the cycle reinforces itself. More information does not reduce anxiety. It sustains. The decision remains open, and the mind stays alert. What looks like diligence is often a sophisticated form of avoidance. Not avoidance of effort, but avoidance of ownership. At this point, it becomes clear that the problem isn't a lack of intelligence or a lack of effort. Most people don't struggle with decisions because they're careless. They struggle because they care. When a decision feels important, the instinctive response is to gather more information, more articles, more opinions, more comparisons. It feels responsible. It feels rational. But something subtle happens as information accumulates. Instead of narrowing the field, each new piece of information opens another branch, another possibility, another risk to consider. The decision space doesn't shrink, it expands. Psychologically, this creates a specific kind of tension, not confusion, but cognitive overload. The brain isn't designed to hold dozens of competing futures at once. It prefers clarity over completeness. So when too many options remain alive in the mind, the brain switches from deciding to monitoring. You're no longer choosing, you're observing possibilities. This is why people often describe the feeling as, "I just need a bit more time," or "I'm almost there." What's actually happening is not progress, but suspension. Consider a familiar example. Someone is choosing a career move. They research salaries, growth potential, work-life balance, company culture, industry trends. Each factor makes sense on its own, but together they create a web. Every option looks acceptable. Every option carries uncertainty. And because nothing is clearly wrong, nothing feels clearly right. So the mind keeps searching for the missing piece of information that will make the decision obvious. But that piece rarely exists. In reality, most meaningful decisions do not become clearer with more data. They become clearer when criteria are limited. Yet limiting criteria feels uncomfortable. It feels like giving something up, like ignoring useful information. So instead, people keep everything on the table. And in doing so, they delay. This leads to a paradox. The more someone wants to make the right decision, the harder it becomes to make any decision at all. This isn't a failure of logic. It's a predictable human response. When outcomes matter, uncertainty feels threatening, and information feels like protection. But information without hierarchy doesn't reduce uncertainty, it multiplies it. At this stage, people often blame themselves. They assume they're overthinking, or that they lack discipline. But what's really missing is not effort, it's constraint. Without constraint, the brain cannot close a loop. So the decision remains open, revisited again and again, not because the answer isn't there, but because too many answers are. And this is the moment where decisions quietly stall, not with panic, not with drama, but with endless consideration. There is another reason why decisions stall, even when people are aware that they're stuck. Indecision doesn't always feel bad. In fact, it can feel surprisingly safe. When a decision is postponed, nothing is lost immediately. No doors are closed. No mistakes are confirmed. Psychologically, this creates a sense of control. As long as the decision remains open, every option still feels possible, and possibility feels comforting. This is where information plays a second role, not as a tool for clarity, but as a justification for delay. Research in behavioral psychology shows that people often confuse preparation with progress. Reading one more article, watching one more comparison, asking one more person for advice. Each action feels productive. Each action reduces anxiety in the moment, but none of them move the decision forward. This creates what psychologists sometimes describe as decision inertia. Once someone enters this state, the mind begins to protect it. Information that supports delay feels reassuring. Information that demands commitment feels threatening. So attention becomes selective, not toward clarity, but toward comfort. This is why people can stay undecided for months, sometimes years, without feeling urgency. The absence of immediate consequences removes pressure. And without pressure, there is no trigger to choose. What's important here is that this is not irrational. It's adaptive. From an evolutionary perspective, delaying a risky choice could be safer than acting too soon. But modern decisions are different. Career choices, relationships, long-term plans, they don't resolve themselves with time. They compound. And the longer a decision remains open, the heavier it feels. Ironically, the delay that once felt protective eventually becomes the source of stress. People begin to feel stuck, not because they lack options, but because they've kept all options alive for too long. At this stage, the problem is no longer information. It's emotional attachment to possibility. Letting go of options feels like loss, even when those options were never real commitments. And that emotional cost is often stronger than the fear of making a wrong choice. This explains why awareness alone doesn't fix indecision. People can understand the logic, they can see the pattern, and still remain stuck. Because the issue isn't knowing, it's releasing. And release is psychologically expensive. This is where most explanations stop, but it's also where understanding needs to deepen. So what actually helps decisions move forward? It's not more information, and it's not more confidence. It's constraint. Decisions tend to progress when the space of possibility becomes smaller. Not because the answer is clearer, but because the mind is no longer protecting every option. Constraints change the psychological landscape. When time is limited, when options are reduced, or when a choice becomes irreversible, the brain switches modes. It stops optimizing for comfort and starts optimizing for resolution. This is why deadlines work, even when they are artificial. This is why commitments feel uncomfortable but effective. Constraints remove the illusion that waiting is neutral. They introduce cost. Once cost is present, indecision becomes harder to maintain. Importantly, constraints don't create better answers. They create movement. From a behavioral perspective, clarity often comes after commitment, not before. People tend to believe the opposite, that clarity should precede action. But in many real-world decisions, clarity is a consequence. The act of choosing forces the mind to organize information differently. Details that once felt overwhelming suddenly become relevant or irrelevant. Meaning begins to form only after alternatives are closed. This explains why advice alone rarely helps. Advice adds information, but it doesn't reduce possibility. Without constraint, information simply accumulates. This is also why people say, "I knew what to do once I finally decided." The decision didn't reveal the answer. It created it. And this is where the common narrative breaks. Indecision is often framed as a lack of insight. But in many cases, it's the absence of structure. Not knowing isn't the problem. Having too much room to avoid choosing is. Once the space narrows, the mind adapts quickly. Not because it found certainty, but because uncertainty became unavoidable. This is uncomfortable, but it's also functional. And it explains something important. Why progress so often feels worse right before it starts to work. Because constraint feels like loss, even when it leads to resolution. This tension is not a flaw in human thinking. It's part of how decisions actually happen. Understanding this doesn't make choosing easy, but it reframes the struggle. And that reframing matters more than one more piece of information. This creates a subtle paradox. The more someone tries to understand a decision, the harder it can become to make one. At first, learning feels productive. New information brings relief. It creates the sense that progress is happening. But over time, that relief turns into delay. Understanding expands the map, but it doesn't narrow the path. Each new perspective adds context. Each explanation adds nuance. Soon, every option feels defensible. And when everything can be justified, nothing feels urgent. This is where many decisions stall. Not because the person is confused, but because they are too well informed. They can see the trade-offs. They can anticipate the consequences. They can imagine multiple futures. The mind becomes occupied with managing possibility instead of resolving them. This is why people often say, "I just need a bit more time." What they usually mean is, "I'm trying to reduce discomfort without closing options." Understanding is doing its job, but it's doing a different job than deciding. From a cognitive standpoint, analysis is a form of protection. It delays commitment. It postpones loss. And as long as analysis continues, no option has to be abandoned. This makes understanding feel safe. But safety is not the same as progress. The problem isn't intelligence. It isn't overthinking. It's that the task has shifted. The mind is still collecting when what the situation requires is selecting. Without a moment where options close, analysis has no natural endpoint. It can continue indefinitely without producing movement. This explains why some of the most thoughtful people struggle the longest with decisions. They aren't missing information. They are missing a stopping point. And until something changes the structure, understanding alone won't create it. This doesn't mean understanding is useless. It means it has limits. And confusing understanding with decision-making is one of the most common ways progress quietly stalls. Because of this, many people assume that decisions fail due to emotion, fear, anxiety, lack of confidence. But in most cases, emotion isn't the problem. Structure is. Decisions don't happen when someone feels ready. They happen when the structure changes, when options narrow, when time closes, when consequences become unavoidable. Until then, the mind has no reason to commit. This is why waiting for clarity rarely works. Clarity doesn't arrive first. Commitment creates clarity after. But that idea feels uncomfortable because it challenges the belief that there is a right answer waiting to be found. In reality, most meaningful decisions don't reveal themselves as correct. They become correct after alternatives are no longer available. This is why people keep searching, not for information, but for permission. Permission to choose without certainty. Permission to move without guarantees. When that permission doesn't exist, the mind keeps analyzing. Not because it's irresponsible, but because the structure allows delay. As long as nothing forces a reduction, everything remains open. And openness feels intelligent. But intelligence doesn't resolve decisions. Constraints do. Once constraints appear, the same person who felt stuck often moves quickly. Not because they changed internally, but because the situation did. This suggests something important. Decision-making is not a personality trait. It's not a mindset. It's a response to structure. When structure stays open, indecision is rational. When structure closes, action becomes natural. Understanding this reframes the problem. The issue isn't why people hesitate. It's why the situation allows hesitation to continue. And without a shift in structure, no amount of insight will force movement. This is why decisions often feel sudden, even after long periods of thinking. Nothing changed inside the person. The environment changed around them. And once it did, the decision followed. So when decisions feel heavy, it may not be because something is wrong. It may be because nothing has changed yet. Indecision isn't always resistance. Sometimes it's alignment with an open structure. And clarity isn't a signal you wait for. It's something that often appears after movement begins. Seen this way, many moments of hesitation stop looking like failure. They look like pauses that only make sense in context. Not every decision needs urgency. Not every choice needs certainty. What matters is recognizing what actually causes movement and noticing when nothing is meant to move yet. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If this perspective helped, a like, comment, or share supports this work. And if you want more reflections like this, consider subscribing.